Hey, it's Paul Banis of GreatDad.com here with my weekly news series on resilience and how you can get it, why you need it. And we're talking to experts every week and then peppering in a few practical comments on my own. And I hope you continue to join on this. We're trying to make this very practical and action oriented so that you can really feel like you're progressing with this short series. So today we've got a coach and an author who's a specialist on happiness, which is part of the whole resilience package. So I want to welcome Peter Teuscher. Welcome, Peter.
Great to be with you, Paul. Appreciate it.
So we talked a little bit before we started about happiness. Maybe we could just start there. Is what I think there's a lot of discussion about that happiness isn't really a thing. It's a combination of a lot of things, but it's this amorphous concept. But what do you think is what do you think is the relationship between happiness and resilience?
Well, I guess a good place to start is, to recognize that happiness is something that's important for you to define for yourself.
Mm.
For me, you know, happiness is a really great kind of feedback that can tell us either, are our behaviors and our choices leading us to where we want to be, or are we framing things or looking at life in a way that is affecting our happiness. So sometimes it's our perspective, and sometimes it's a really good feedback mechanism to help us understand, where we're going off track. Are we not living in alignment with our values? Are we, making choices that are not in alignment with our sort of deeper emotional needs or desires that, we maybe haven't brought to the surface or recognized? And so I think that for the second piece, I think that really relates to the resilience part. Sometimes our brains are wired so that we see the problems, we see the challenges, but sometimes we don't see the good stuff. And that can be sometimes the cause of our unhappiness. But again, happiness for me is just kind of the feedback. It's not the end result. It's kind of a good measure. Are we living a fulfilled life? Are we living our highest potential?
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like almost more like, I think a lot of people, when they think happiness, they think like a big yellow smiley face.
Yeah.
And you sound like you're defining happiness more as a feeling of life satisfaction and ease and those types of things that are more of I guess they're still a feeling, but they're not this like, happy smiley feeling. It's something more calming. Is that right?
Yeah. I think a lot of the important message that I start off with in the book is happiness is something. It's really important for you to define it for yourself, because
Mm.
if you don't understand what you're trying to experience, because happiness is in the moment. It's not something, it's not this destination. And some people will think, well, what's going to make me happy is, well, when I finally retire and, sit at the beach with my umbrella drinks, that's going to make me happy. But that doesn't really fulfill anyone. And if you're going to wait for some point in the future to be happy, that's really undermining the potential for a really fulfilling life. But to answer your question, for me, feeling fulfilled, feeling a sense of purpose, feeling like I add value, those are things I know make me happy. But there's lots of things in the moment, just being in nature, just
Yeah.
spending time with the family. There's lots of little moments, and if we're in the present and we can recognize that, it will lead to a lot more happiness.
But do you think that's part of just based on our consumer society, that we are so geared toward like the end result rather than, like you say, the journey and all the little steps along the way? I mean, is it purely that?
I think that a lot of it is conditioning. I get some people that come to me for coaching, and they feel like, listen, I've done everything right. Maybe they've done the college, they've got the career, maybe they've got a family,
Sure.
or they don't, but they've checked all these boxes that are meant to lead them to happiness. And then they realize, where I've gotten isn't making me happy. What's wrong? You even see famous people that seem to have achieved everything and are
Right.
still unhappy. And so I think it's just how we've defined happiness is kind of out of sync with, what we really desire, what we really need, what our values truly are.
Hmm. So back to the resilience part, do you see
Yeah.
resilience then as one of those ways to get to that feeling, or are they so intertwined that you can't even separate them? And because in a lot of my discussions, I talked about it almost be like this flywheel effect, is that it feeds on itself. The more like joy you can get out of the moment, the stronger you are when you're faced with a challenge, for example.
Absolutely. That's why I look at it as this feedback loop, right? The
Yeah.
happiness is really the feedback we're getting. And so a lot of the resilience comes from, So in the book, I talk a lot about, the changing your, and this is true for me because I've got a history of, building a business and everybody thinking I was super successful, but I was unhappy and I was depressed. I have a history of depression, and that's long behind me now. And I found the fundamental thing to help me get through that was changing the way I think and believe, and sort of looking at my beliefs and reassessing them and recognizing I can change what I believe, and it makes a huge difference in how I see the world and how I experience it. And I think that's a big factor in resilience. When you recognize that it's in your power, I think there's a lot of people who feel like a victim. And when you recognize actually the power is in your hands to make a
Yeah.
change, and there's opportunity in every moment for that.
Yeah, I read a lot about this within the positive psychology world, this victim part and the role that we're kind of playing right now, at least in the United States. You're in Germany, maybe you feel it there too, but this whole idea of like the world is against me, and certainly there are people in the culture who've been definitely victimized for a long period of time, but allowing yourself to be a victim seems to play a huge role, whatever the circumstance. But I worry that sometimes people are taking on that mantle of I'm just a victim, and then not leaning into what we're talking about, which is trying to shed that belief and still have your own life, even if you are enduring prejudice, exclusion, all kinds of other things. Is that there's still an opportunity to not have that victim part hold you back or hold you down.
Absolutely. I call it the victim trap, because we
Yeah,
get trapped by this idea and this identity when we start to
yeah,
identify with this past experience that where we were in all likelihood victimized. But when I talk to some of the most inspiring people I talk to are people who've overcome this, and they don't identify as a victim, even though everyone else around them sees them that way. And,
yeah.
and I think when you can let go of that, it's far more empowering. If your identity is, I'm a victim of this or that, how empowering is that? Because you're kind of stuck in this past experience, which is very legitimate, very real. But if you've worked through it and you've
Right.
become successful, then there's no need to hold on to that identity, right? And I think that's an important piece.
So I don't know if you work with both men and women, but do you see a change between how men and women deal with that particular?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. It's starting to change, but I do get a lot more women coming to me for coaching than I do men.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
starting to, in the business world, when the company is paying for it, but people who are looking for personal coaches, it seems to be that women are more open to talking about this stuff
sure.
and doing the personal development work. It's encouraging to see more and more men doing it, but they're still in the minority. And so I think there's just this openness to look at your feelings and be willing to work on it and be willing to change. And I think men want to project this aura of strength, and they just want to tough it out and push on through. And I think that's where they miss the opportunity to reflect and go inward and recognize, actually there's some things in me that I can change that will affect the success and happiness that I have in my life.
It's very interesting because I was watching a social scientist on a program. It was a Bill Maher show a couple months ago, where one of the guests was explaining, and this was a woman saying this, it wasn't a guy, but she was saying how when women look back on how they've been treated over the last century and prior, they get together and they complain about being a victim and talk about how bad it's been. If men are in that same situation, they tend to say, how are we going to fight it? Or how are we going to, fight it probably rather than in a group, but their reaction to that is different. And maybe you could say that men haven't been as victimized, so they're not carrying all that baggage. But that sexual difference was interesting to me, especially because I worry so much about the victim complex kind of holding you back. Back to what you were saying, I'm interested in what you were saying about how you can change your beliefs. Can you give an example of how you did it, and maybe that would help somebody else who's thinking like they have a belief like I'm just not I'm not good at public speaking, or I'm not good with people, or I think that's the kind of belief you're talking about, how you change those beliefs.
Absolutely. And I look at three sort of areas where our beliefs come from. So we'll have experiences that we will then say, make an assumption of this is the way things are. It could be one experience. I had a coaching client and she said, this always happens to me. And then we kind of looked back at it and it had happened twice in her life.
Yeah.
And it had become this belief that's just the way it is. So our experiences will contribute to our beliefs. The influences we have around us, the repeated messages that we have around us will contribute to our beliefs. And then the thoughts we think repetitively, the habits we develop, they will contribute to our beliefs. And so I look at those three areas. And so when you are trying to change a belief, maybe it's a matter of having a different experience in order to convince yourself actually something different is possible. Actually, something different is very true. You
mean
can
like
change
trying something again just to see whether you can.
exactly.
Yeah.
The way some people overcome their fears, they have a fear of public speaking, as you said, and so they'll speak in front of a small group and then a bigger group, and
Yeah.
then they'll overcome that, and they'll confirm to themselves that actually it's not that scary, and I can do it. It's not this, well, I'm not good at that. In fact, that's a fixed mindset where we can shift to, well, I'm not good at it yet. So that's one possibility. One thing I really encourage, and when I did some traveling after selling the business in Canada, did some traveling through Asia, and I had no exposure really to a lot of media and so on, including the news. And you would think, oh, well, I'm not informed and so on. But I found it was very liberating not to have that exposure regularly. So I still like to stay informed, but now it's more measured. I keep a handle on how much exposure I have to the negative news. So, or if you have people around you that are complaining all the time, all of that stuff will inform your view of reality and contribute to certain beliefs. And the other thing is just having, one of my coaching mottos is awareness allows change. And so because, you bring these things to the surface. And so a lot of time we have these deep-seated beliefs, and they come from these kind of repetitive thoughts that we always have that continue to confirm those beliefs. And so I like to use affirmations. If you believe that you're not good at something, or there's never enough money or whatever, I'll create a statement for myself that is believable to me, that's in the current moment, and that, that affirms the positive. And then, that can be anything. It's just very personal. But what will happen is you'll start to have that thought less and until it goes away. So every time that negative thought pops up, you have that sort of statement ready to go, and then it confirms the opposite, and that thought becomes less and less. And the less you think that thought, you'll find it opens up the ability to believe new things and see the world in a new way.
So I'm really interested in that the difference there between skills-based criticism, self-criticism versus, I don't know what it is, personality, or, your inside, like I'm not a good person, or I'm always going to be sad, or I'm never going to be able to love somebody, those bigger things versus I can't play the piano, or I can't make a speech well. I mean, obviously you could in some of those cases, you could take lessons and you may never get to be a good public speaker. You may never learn how to play the piano. I know that from personal experience. But I think in that first case of like failing at a skills-based thing, skiing or piano or whatever, is the knowledge that you try and you get beyond the just, I'm no good at it, to the point of like, I've tried it, I've worked at it. The fact that I'm not doing it as well as Mozart is not a reflection of me as a person. It is a skill that I should have learned when I was 4 or whatever, but that's no reflection on me as me. Whereas the other thing is harder. Those other kinds of beliefs, I think, are harder to reconcile without being kind of Pollyanna-ish about them.
Yeah, you're right. And I think there are, as you say, as you're trying to develop skills, there are people, if you're comparing yourself to someone who's been doing it since 4 years old, yeah, but these kind of things that criticize your self-worth and, your value as a human being, those are things where, I like Byron Katie's approach, where she talks about, the work for her is always asking, when it comes to those kind of deep-seated beliefs about, your value and your legitimacy, to ask yourself, is that true? And then show me the evidence that it's true, and look for the reasons that statement, because I really believe, for me, beliefs are not about true or not true. They are a question of, are they useful to me? Where's the utility? Because if you look at it, I mean, most of our life is more beliefs than facts and, reality, because we build all these systems that, they only work because everyone believes in them. And so belief has such a massive impact on our lives. And then then if obviously if something is rooted in science and fact, I'm not going to say, well, I believe something different. But these things, a lot of these philosophical things that we can't necessarily prove if they're true or not, you can ask yourself, is this good for me to believe? Is this useful for me to believe? And I think that's a really important question to ask yourself. And so if you believe that you're not good enough or that you're not worthy, those are not useful beliefs. Those are
Yeah.
not going to help you be successful and be a good partner in a relationship or be a good parent, right? None of these things. The example of the airplane is always given where you've got to put your own mask on before helping others. You've got to make sure that you are resilient and happy and being the best person that you can be if you want to be there for other people, right? It's so important. Self-care is something, especially in men, because you brought up men, it's something that often gets overlooked, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's really good advice. Is the whole idea of, is this feeling serving me? Is this belief serving me? And that goes for resentment or regret, those types of things where yes, maybe they're comforting to affirm that the fact that you do feel that feeling, but do you want to keep on dwelling on it, or can you struggle to let it go? Maybe you could, are there ways that you've seen that you can let those things go? Because I think a lot of people say, yeah, well, I can say I'm going to let that, that resentment go, that resentment toward a boss or a partner or whatever. But how do you do that concretely?
Well, it really depends on what the issue is. There
Yeah.
are some things that are rooted in trauma, and as a
Yeah.
coach, that's not something that I cover. I think that I have enough clients that I've recommended to. I have my network of
Mhm.
therapists I send people to. I've been through therapy, so I know that it works and I know it's valuable. But if there are other things, I have a few core principles in my personal philosophy, and one of them is assessing my decisions or my choices based on, is this based in love or is it based in fear? And a lot of the actions we take and choices that we make are driven by some form of fear. And I find that when you can recognize that in yourself or in other people, you tend to judge it or react less harshly. So in yourself, when you recognize, actually, this is a strategy that I've developed, or this is a response that I'm having because there's some sort of fear in me, right? A fear of
Mhm.
not being good enough, or a fear of, what's going to happen to my reputation. But also sometimes when other people react badly to you, if you look at it as a form of fear, you tend to judge them less
Oh,
hard, right?
yes.
And so I think having for yourself a little strategy like that, or reframing it, really is helpful, because sometimes the reason that you don't want to let go of it because you want to avoid making that mistake in the future and avoid putting yourself in that position with another person again and again. But the question is that strategy really working for you,
Yeah.
right? So when you can kind of come to terms with that and recognize the source of your fear or the source of that emotion in you, then that's usually the best way to leave it behind. It seems to resolve itself.
Yeah, I know it sounds like we're getting farther afield from resilience, but these are really, these are part and parcel of what I think a lot of coaches work on all the time with their clients. That are these basic skills that you have to learn to take on, and new habits. So you talked about the surrounding yourself with more positivity, the knowledge of when you're triggered, and what was the third thing you
Are you
said?
talking about changing your beliefs,
Yeah.
or?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in terms of changing your beliefs, so is your environment good? Is your environment feeding your beliefs? Are there experiences that you've had that have
Yeah.
led you to false beliefs, or are there thinking habits that you have that keep you stuck in old beliefs? And I think when you can really establish some positive beliefs for yourself that support your success and happiness, I think that's a big contributor to resilience for
Yeah.
me, right? Because
Yeah.
you're really in control of that.
Yeah. So in terms of the what we often talk in coaching about, ease and flow and pushing and pulling, how you're driven by different things. I sometimes have my clients make out a list of all the things that they do and then ask them to evaluate what are the things there that they love versus what are the things that they like are motivated by fear that my wife won't love me anymore if I'm not an author of a book. Yeah, I'm struggling with that myself. Versus where I find I find passion to get there, or a love for a thing. And then there are certain things that you do just because you have to do them, like taking out the trash. I don't have a passion for that, but I do that, and it's not out of fear or love. It's just one of those things that has to be done, even though I might not like it.
Yeah, so there I really am conscious of the kind of language we use. We talk about things
Mm,
we have
good.
to do or should do.
Right.
And I think and this goes back to this whole sense of feeling victimized, right? When we're our lives are run by obligation, it makes us feel like we're out of control. But when you frame it in a way that, like you say, well, I have to take out the trash. Well, no, I want to take it out because I don't like the way things would be if I don't do that,
Well,
right? I don't have to go to work. I go because I recognize that the paycheck that I get is for me worth the time I'm putting in, or whatever that is. But when you can frame it in a way for yourself that is a choice rather than this obligation or I'm being forced to, it's quite liberating. And I think reframing it that way is a super helpful process.
yeah, I love that reframing, because it does change the way you look at it. I think we do get stuck in those things like, I have to go to work. You don't have to go to work. There are many other things that there are many other things that you do other than the current work that you're doing, and certainly some people do.
And I think recognizing that it's a choice that you make. You can choose not to go to work. You can choose not to work at all. It may mean that you end up being homeless, which you don't like. And so you make the choice to go to work, right?
Right.
I had a client once, and we ended up getting into her personal life. And she was talking about some real challenges with her husband that were, a bit worrying for me. And so I asked her the question because she wasn't willing to explore the concept of leaving her husband. And I said, I'm
Mm,
not recommending
right.
you leave your husband, but when you choose consciously to stay with him, that's a big shift, right? Where you're saying, well, because of the kids or whatever, I'm going to stay in this situation because I have to. That's obligation. But when you say, no, I'm confident I can work through this. We're going to do this together. It's a choice. And that is so empowering when you can look at it that way.
Yeah. Well, that seems to bring up this word that we hear all the time now, this word agency, which I don't even know what that means anymore, because it's used in so many different situations. But it is, I think at the core, it is this idea that you are in charge of you, and all the other things that you may hate or love in the world, it still comes back to you in that world. And I think that's something that a lot of people learn. They don't learn that until really a lot later in life. Do you have any tips or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's just raising your level of awareness and challenging those thoughts that tell you that I have to do this, or I'm a victim of this, or I have no control over the situation. At the end of the day, you can only focus on the things that you can control
Yeah.
and let go of the things that you can't. And that's much easier said than done. I
Yeah.
recognize that. But getting into that state where you recognize, okay, what can I control here? What can I change? And those are the things I'm going to put my energy into and focus on, and everything else will hopefully work itself out, with the actionable things that I can change. I find that's a really helpful way. Otherwise, if we're focusing all of our attention and energy on the things that we can't even do anything about, which, the things you see on the news a lot of the times that get people all worked up, you can vote, right? If you
Right.
don't like the politics, but other than that, what else can you really do? So is it worth putting your energy and time into it? And if you're in a situation that you're not willing to change, where you say, well, I've chosen that I'm going to stay the course here, well, then don't complain about it. Get on to the things that you can change and do something about.
Yeah. Yeah. So those, to me, a lot of those things, like, we know them out of, old sayings, we know the serenity prayer, or whatever. And like you said, it's really hard. It's easier said than done. One of the things that I think a lot of us coaches are doing more actively now is trying to instill these habits, which I know that's important to you. Is like, how do you, like, I mean, in Christianity, people do recite the serenity prayer like every day. And that's one of those affirming messages that you need to keep on repeating to yourself. Otherwise, I mean, if you just read it like once a year or something, it's not going to have any effect on your mindset. Are there what are there other habits like that you recommend that people try to instill and do on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think, as I said, awareness allows change. So how do we get to a higher degree of awareness? And I think making time for yourself every day for reflection is really important.
Mm,
Whether it's a habit of journaling, to get your thoughts out and recognize, oh, I see that these are thoughts or beliefs that are not helping me. And, learning to be what makes people a lot happier is learning to be more grateful for the things that they've got, right? And I think when you have time every day, whether it's a break at lunch to go walk in nature, or you start your day with, morning pages, writing in your journal, or you finish your day in that kind of reflective, okay, what went right today? What could I have done differently? What would I like to do different tomorrow? I think when you take that time for reflection, it's worth an incredible amount, because a lot of times people will just kind of, onto the next thing, onto the next thing, and they don't stop to reflect, and then they continue to make the same choices that they see as mistakes, right? But they don't take the time to reflect on, what did I like, what didn't I like, what could I have chosen differently, what was in my power to change. It's all about having the awareness, and that doesn't come unless you take some time to reflect.
yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly, if you don't even understand that you are being triggered by an event of a certain type that happens to you over and over again, how can you ever change your response to it if you are so consumed with the anger or the frustration rather than trying to figure out the root cause?
Yeah. And there's a really basic thing that I love to remind myself of. It's on my phone. It's Thich Nhat Hanh, who, sadly passed away not that long ago, but he talks about pause, breathe, smile, and that puts you all of a sudden in a state where you're centered, you're present, you're in the moment, and that's the state you can start to reflect on and be a little bit more aware. And
Yeah.
I find that's a super easy one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you could develop the habit to do that. So is that when you talk in your book about habits to help you find joy in the moment, is that really at the center of that? Like if I'm just walking down the street, how do I find joy in that moment?
Well, look, the book is one where it's a coaching book, because at each chapter, I ask a number of different questions. And again, it comes back to, how do you define happiness? And so when you recognize what happiness means to you, it'll be easier for you to pursue it. So and I cover different areas of your life. And for some people, value a lot of the work I do with people, one of the first steps is to look at their core values, because
Mhm.
sometimes, the work they're doing, they're unhappy because it conflicts with some of their values, the relationship they're in, and so I think recognizing what your core values are and making sure that the life you're living is in alignment with that is a
Yeah.
really important one. So that's why I look at different areas of your life, from choices to the lifestyle that you're living, to, what's your philosophy on relationships, on communication, and all of that. So I look at building a set of beliefs. People shy away from philosophy, but we all have some kind of a philosophy. We all have a set
Sure.
of beliefs. And I think when you can look at, in this area of my life where I feel unhappy, what beliefs are contributing to that. And so that's where I specialize, that's where I focus on, is really that recognizing how the beliefs are impacting your life and how to change them.
Yeah. Well, I do for me, the whole practice of gratitude is if you are feeling momentarily down and you're walking along and you want to feel a little bit happier, just to focus on all of the great things around you, and you'll see a shift immediately. It's just
Yeah.
astounding. One thing that also you talk about in the book is engaging in things that make you happy. And I think this is quite often forgotten in our world, and maybe comes back to those ideas of shoulds and wills and all the rest of it. But why do you think people don't do that? That they don't, I guess they don't, on a macro scale, they don't pursue their dreams, but they also don't even do the small things that make themselves happy. Is that like a Calvinistic kind of,
I think there are
approach to the world?
multiple reasons. There are people who don't really feel they deserve it, or they don't prioritize it. They don't have the time for it. It seems for some people that, they feel like, well, happiness is very frivolous, and I need
Right,
to
right.
focus on the practical things. I don't have time for it. And so part of it is making it a priority. But, happiness can be found in such little moments and we overlook them. And I remember reading, this made such an impression on me when I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about being in a horrible concentration camp, and yet he finds this joy in this experiencing this sunbeam on cold morning. And I think when you can get to the point, and look, it's hard in our fast-paced life, but
Sure.
if someone, that's a perfect example for me, if someone living such a in such horrible conditions can find that moment to appreciate a sunbeam or someone's smile, or their pet, those, if we can anchor in those little things, and it starts with the little things, and we tend to look for these big moments in our lives, the great vacation, and the promotion or the success, and then everything in between we kind of treat it like filler. And that's such a shame, because life's full of lots of great little moments that are
Yeah.
in those moments in between the big successes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I did the Noom diet to lose 10 pounds a year ago. And one of the things that they really have you focus on, for example, is to eat less, but to really focus, like you have a handful of tortilla chips, which are not good for you in any stretch of the imagination. But if
Yeah.
you're going to have, a handful of them, count them out and focus on them, savor every one as if, it's like a really important thing that you're doing. And it fundamentally changed the experience. I'm back to eating like 3 handfuls at once. But while I was doing that diet, I was so transformed in terms of when I eat foods, just feeling all those sensations is completely different than the way we usually live our lives.
Absolutely. In those moments where I agree. Eating is one of those things that I guess living in Europe, or really, you go to Italy and they
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
their ritual, but just really appreciating the quality, or even if it's a snack food, just going, this is great, but being in the moment and being conscious of it. I think we go through so much of our life in somewhat of a unconscious or half conscious kind of way. And I think, it takes practice to sort of take a moment and go, wow, this is really great. This is a really great moment. And it's not just the highlights, it's those simple moments, like people who go, I just love that moment in the morning where I have my coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I think if we had more of those moments where we just savor and appreciate those moments where we can just have a few minutes to ourselves and enjoy a beverage or enjoy a conversation and things like that. And it's just being aware that those are the things that contribute to the overall happiness, having more of those moments.
Yeah. And not waiting for the big perfect moment, but finding all those those little like instants of joy is really key part of this
Yeah.
equation, I think.
Especially because those big moments have so much pressure on them to be great. And then we get disappointed when it doesn't meet those really high expectations that we have. And, the expectations is another thing that really affects our happiness. When we have all these expectations for the way things should be, and just instead of just saying, accepting things for how they are, but also appreciating what's in the moment. I like how Eckhart Tolle talks about, so many people treat the present moment like it's this obstacle to overcome, right? Instead of going, okay, it is what it is, and there's good and bad in all moments, but I'm
Right.
going to take what I can out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in America, we have a real problem with dealing with the gray. And things aren't always like nirvana or hell. There's something in between, and if you can't appreciate the parts of it that are in between, you're missing out on 99.9999% of life, right?
Absolutely. We live in the Western world, and I think that recognizing the contrast in the world, when I traveled through Asia, and this was, more than 20 years ago, I met people who had really very little based on our standards, but they were happier than a lot of people that I knew that were successful
Yeah.
and high achievers. And so it's, a lot of high achievers, like there are people who call themselves high performance coaches, but I don't think, the people who go for high performance coaching are already pretty high performers. I think what those people need to learn is not to go from one success to the next, because you'll achieve something and that success will last seconds and you're always already on to the next thing. It's just savoring those moments more, and whether they're big or small.
So one last question, because this is something that interests me, and I hear it a lot with some clients, and I also know coaches who've said this to me, is that they don't know how to have fun, that they don't experience or they don't search for experiences that are purely fun. There always has to be some intrinsic benefit to them. If they go to a museum, it's because they're researching a book or they're
Yeah.
preparing for something. They just don't possess that ability to have fun. have you seen that? And do you think that's a fundamental problem, or do you think that's just a mix up in the language of how we describe fun? Like one man's punishment is another man's fun kind of thing.
Yeah, I think really ambitious people have that problem the most because they need to find utility in everything they're
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of that sometimes as well. And so, they're giving yourself permission to really have those frivolous moments, to just do something for the sake of doing it. There's a lot of joy in that. And there are people who will overindulge on that, they're not so worried about their productivity or whatever. I think productivity can also make people happy, doing things that fulfill
Sure.
them. But those people who are high achievers and high performers who are just on from one thing to the next, it's reminding them, sometimes they've forgotten. And I really work with people to go back to their childhood and those things that, kids, this is where kids are such a great teacher for us, because they get fascinated with the simplest little things. They find joy in those, and to go back to those moments where they were able to really just frivolously enjoy the littlest things in life.
Yeah. Great. All right. So I think we're wrapping up now with covered a lot of ground in terms of happiness versus resilience and all the little elements which you need to include in that thinking of how to be able to learn how to bounce back in the face of everyday challenges. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is not only for the dads, but is to model the type of behavior for your kids. If they can get some of that resilience through osmosis, I mean, at some point they probably need to learn some of these tips and tricks as well. But just you as a dad being more resilient, not going crazy with every new thing that's thrown your way, makes for far better relationship and happier home life.
Yeah. And I think happiness is a big contributor to resilience. When you look at happy people who are authentically happy, you'll find they're better parents, better neighbors, better citizens. They make better choices because they're coming from a place of joy and fulfillment, rather than this longing and there's not enough and I need to get more. And I think if you can get to that state, you'll be an excellent example and role model for the kids in your life and the young people that are looking up to you.
Okay, great. Well, Peter Teuscher, thanks for joining us. You can find your coaching service at peterteuscher.com, but I know you really want to talk about your book, which covers a lot of this. It's called Rethinking Happiness, and you can find that on Amazon, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Paul. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter. I think there's a lot in our conversation that dovetails with all the study that I'm doing as well in terms of positive psychology and trying to create these habits. And I really do recommend a coach or a guide or somebody to keep you on track. You can read your book and you can learn a lot of these things, but a key element is this practice and this habit forming, which a lot of us can't do, purely on our own.
Yeah, I'm a coach and I get coached from other colleagues.
Right.
So I really believe in it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Paul Banis with GreatDad.com. You can find my coaching services, my course on gratitude, a bunch of other free resources at GreatDad.com/go. See you next time. Stay strong.